Okay, if I can get everybody's attention, please. Thank you all for coming. You're very spread out this evening. So tonight is the second lecture for our Civic Scholars program, and you are all in for a great treat. We have two outstanding speakers to talk to you tonight. So please take in everything they have to say. Think about what questions you want to ask. I know some of you have already started reaching out for interviews. I know some of you are already running into issues. So now is the time to ask, and we can try and sort through what some of the problems may be, as well as learn a whole lot. So with that, let me introduce guest number one. We have Brian Corley, who is the Supervisor of Elections for Pasco County. Where's my Pasco person?
Good to see you.
Brett, okay. So we have, Brian is a double degree graduate from the University of South Florida. He is originally from New York. He has also sat on many different boards and organizations that do research as well as oversight on the election system. So not only is he a supervisor of elections, but these issues are things that he has been very steeped in for a long time and is an expert on all of that, which he's going to be relaying to you. So he's going to give you some of the institutional side of this, so the government side of this. He is an example of at least one person that you should be speaking to for your own county, his counterparts there. On the other side, we have, and are fortunate to have the current chair of the Political Science Department, Dr. Dan Smith. You probably should have read at least, I think we put 5 or 6 of his articles into the resource packet that you received at the beginning of the semester. Dan's research is steeped in Florida electoral politics, and that's across a lot of different ways, looking at voting behavior, looking at ballot initiatives, looking at some of the issues that you may uncover in your county. So he's here to talk to you as well about some of his experience, some of his research, talk you through some of his dealings, because he also, as we were just talking, has been a poll worker, has monitored elections in different counties over the past number of years here in Florida, which of course is always quite fascinating and interesting. Great state to be in at election time. So with all of that, I think we're going to start with Brian, who will kick us off here, and then we will move into Dan. We'll probably let both of them talk, and then we'll do Q&A at the end, although if you do have something really burning, raise your hand. I'm sure they won't mind answering a question in the midst of it. But with all that, please, let's welcome Brian Corley.
Make sure you give me the hook, because is anyone Irish in the room, Irish ancestry? So, you can talk about your shoelaces for 7 hours, so you have to cut me off if I speak too long. It's great to be here. I'm actually absolutely honored. Where else but on Valentine's Day would I be with a bunch of fellow poli-sci geeks? This is awesome. But at the end, I'm going to need you all to sign an affidavit for Mrs. Corley to prove I was actually here, if you don't mind. So I want to talk a little bit, when we talk about voting access, when I started to prepare my notes, the first thing I thought of was, where we were, where we are, and where we're going. Obviously, where we were, there were some pretty sad chapters in American history. I don't need to remind us about the various issues with race, gender, and poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. What's amazing is, I was talking on the way here, history is relative with regards to time frame. My daughter, Sarah, is a senior in high school, 4th year ROTC, and she decided she wants to go on the military. She's going to be in the Navy, which super proud of her dad. And I happened to be out in San Diego a couple months ago, and they had the aircraft carrier museum, the Midway, and I'd forgotten this myself, but it wasn't until like 1993 that women were allowed on Navy combat ships. I mean, that seems like it was 100 years ago. So we talk about things that were, when I talk to, we have 72,000 school children in my county, and I feel so strongly about talking to future voters. I'll do it myself. I don't farm it out to one of my staff. And when you tell middle school students, you talk about, you show them a picture of the Berlin Wall and the freedoms, they think like I'm making it up. Or you talk about the Jim Crow era where there are, different water fountains. They literally think that I'm just completely making it up. But before we get to that, a couple things about 2016. We survived it. One of the most surreal election cycles. But here's the irony of the whole thing. It was one of the smoothest run elections from an election administration standpoint. Forget the political time, you all remember Florida 2000, Bush Gore, hanging chads, pregnant chads, all that good stuff. Little factoid you may not know. We all know 537, the lead, right, that Bush had over Gore, out of 6 million cast. Here's a little interesting thing when you're talking to your colleagues. And by the way, my colleagues, when you talk to an SOE, mention that Corley sent you. That hopefully if they like you, that'll get you in. But let me just use Pasco, because people will say my vote doesn't make a difference. In the year 2000 in Pasco County, you can go to PascoVotes.com and check it out if you don't believe me. The number of people who undervoted, just skip the contest for president, it's an easy number, 1776. That's the number of voters who skipped it. 2,141 voted for more than one. Just Pasco alone could have changed history, let alone the other 66 counties. So that's certainly noteworthy. When I've spent the last year, it seems like the election cycle never ended. And compliments of Vladimir Putin, I've had to become a cyber security expert, or wannabe cybersecurity expert, as it relates to elections, because it's really troubling because, there's no doubt, it's undeniable, there was interference. We know that. Did you all know, it was reported just a few weeks ago in Newsweek, it amazes me to think of this, that, and I forget the actual stats, so bear with me, there was nearly 500,000 Russian bots retweeted Donald Trump tweets nearly 500,000 times in the final weeks of the campaign, and more than 60,000 Americans RSVP'd to a Facebook political event that was fake, imaginary. So we fell for it. So I say that because the goal was to delegitimize the election, right? And there were no votes hacked or flipped, but there are people I know in my county who I've known for many years, and they'll say, and this is really troubling, Brian, I know you, I trust you, you're great, your staff's amazing, but how do I know my vote wasn't hacked? How do I know it wasn't flipped? So I've had to spend the last, probably about 10 months doing a little House Secures My Vote, basically presentation. And it's kind of troubling because their attempt was to delegitimize and polarize us. Is it safe to say we're more polarized than ever in America? So in essence, they won. And now we're hearing reports that they're going to do it again in 2018. And so it's become the bane of my existence. So back to the voting systems. Florida did away with the punch cards. Then we went to the touchscreens. So I got appointed in 2007. I was on the job all of about a month when they were talking about replacing voting systems, going to a paper ballot. Because there was a race in 2006, congressional race, Vern Buchanan, whose son I believe lost last night, right? And Christine Jennings. And the losing candidate said the machines didn't accurately record the vote. It was basically, trust us. Well, I need to verify. Well, trust us because it's on the computer. Now, they were all tested and verified, but paper trail was important. Highly controversial when Florida went back to paper. I literally barely knew where the bathrooms were, and I'm being asked by the media what are my thoughts on switching voting systems. But I got to tell you, we looked real smart in 2016 because you can't hack paper. Worst case scenario is someone could try and manipulate a voter registration system. They could try to cause disruptions and chaos. But with that paper ballot, you can always recreate the election, and that's a very, very, very important note. The last thing I'll say about that is before I get to access, is I've started using the phrase, civility is not a dirty word. In this room, there are varying opinions, different political views and registrations, and that's great. That's what discourse is all about. I'm preaching to the choir. Our founding fathers would have liked that. That's what they wanted. But I think maybe our relatives, I know some of mine, and neighbors and whatnot need to kind of tone it down a little bit. It's getting a little bit out of hand. I actually know somebody who, father and son, father supported one candidate, son supported the other, and because of Facebook bickering back and forth, they're not speaking now. They literally are not communicating father and son. So we need to return to civility. If it were up to me, I don't know how we can make this happen, but I would love to see like they have in Parliament. Wouldn't it be fun if the president went before Congress to answer questions? Wouldn't that be a lot of fun? Especially this president be a real hoot, but I digress. So when we talk about access to voting, let us not forget, Florida is, we're now the third most populous state. We just surpassed my birth state of New York, so that'll certainly bump us up for the next census. But the exact moment we knew who the candidates were, you could have called that day, tweeted, I'm calling California, New York for Hillary Clinton, and I'm calling Texas for Donald Trump. enter Florida. We are the largest battleground state. And I'm blessed to work in Pasco County, which is the 11th largest of the 67. I should say we are blessed, my friend, my fellow Pasco. But we have been known for sometimes the bellwether county. Former Governor Jeb Bush, back in I think 2004, said, "As Pasco goes, so goes Florida." And I have some friends who are consultants. Steve Shell, one of them, who said to me on election night he knew the election was over by 7:15. And I was like, "How's that possible?" He said, "Well, because by 7:01 you had all your early voting and vote by mail statistics on your website, the results, and that compromised 60% of your vote total. By 7:15 we had about 70% of our precincts which had voted." And he basically said the reports he was getting from some of the higher up consultants, if you will, is Florida's lost, I'm going to the bar and getting drunk. Those were their words, mind you. So that's how an important role Florida plays, and it's always going to play that way. Cybersecurity is never ever going to go away. That's going to be the new norm, and I'll talk about online voting a little bit later. So I talked about this. Now Florida, remember, had 5 counties that were under pre-clearance at one time, but it's very, very important when you talk about pre-clearance. You talk about like the Shelby case, for example. You talk about Alabama. If you've not looked it up, if you've never had the opportunity, I highly recommend Google the Alabama literacy test. It will really make you angry. It should, at least. Some of the questions they asked. But it's important to remember Florida was for language access. It was not for outright, hey, you're African American, you're not voting here today. There's a clear distinction. Because Florida gets a bad rap, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. So I'm going to just talk about some issues. I'm told you all are like the smartest students ever, and you guys have amazing questions, so I'm looking forward to that. But what I jotted down when I just kind of a free flow of ideas, and if you have questions, we can certainly talk about them as I'm going through them, but with regards to voting access, okay, we've had some sad chapters in our history, but I would submit, respectfully, it has never been easier to register to vote and to vote. Are there barriers? Yes, there are. But you're lucky because I have solutions. I'm not saying they're the right solutions, but I have solutions. So, for example, voter ID. How many of you say voter ID is necessary for voting, for the election? One. Just so you know, I count votes. This is kind of like a not really sure. Is that like a halfway? Okay, is that a proud? Okay. How many of you say, no way, you don't need voter ID. It's disenfranchising people. Okay, gotcha. Here's the dilemma we have from an elections administrator standpoint. We have to balance the access to voting, if you will, with the integrity of the process. I support voter ID, and I'll tell you why. Because the integrity, to me, is paramount. Much like we're talking about questioning the outcome with what happened with the interference in last year, the same could be said about voter ID. There are people absolutely convinced that everything will be stolen, and without, you just show up and you sign a ballot. You've seen those groups that do that on YouTube. But for those of you that said, no, don't need ID, what about this? What about, here's a scenario. You go to the clerk of the court to file a court document. You check off a little box that you're indigent. Legally meaning you can't afford to pay the ridiculous court filing fee of the legislature. We live in Florida. We don't have taxes. We just raise fees, which is the same thing. But you can't afford it. So guess what? Your document gets the same stamp as the person next to you who's got the lawyer wearing a $1,000 suit. Why should voting be any different? So I happen to have in our county Senator Fasano, who was a longtime member of the legislature, both in the House and Senate, who got appointed by Governor Scott to be tax collector. And when he became tax collector, I met with him and I explained this concern. His solution was, here's an idea, Corley. Why don't you send him over my way? We'll get him an ID. So what if, for those of you that said, nope, I'm not in favor of voter ID, what if we allowed or gave access to folks and gave them an ID for voting purposes? Would that appease you, or you still say, no way? Did I make my case or no?
How about this, Brian?
Yes.
Do you vote by absentee mail? Do you use a voter ID? I rest my case.
Yeah, true.
And we don't even get to see you when you send in your absentee ballot.
That's their area for right for front.
But you're okay with people showing up and saying, I'm Daniel A. Smith, here I am, I'm going to sign my name, but I should have to show an ID, but you sending an absentee ballot in where we don't even see you fill out your ballot, we don't know who's doing that, you're okay with that. All right.
But remember this though, the first time you do vote by mail though, you have to produce ID.
That's true.
That's the only key difference is the first time.
Because after that, we know it's all good.
Yeah, exactly. Who would possibly cheat on that? Yes.
Isn't with absentee ballots, you also have to compare your signature when you have.
Yes, and notice I said earlier, vote by mail. It's all marketing. We noticed we had a lot of senior citizens who thought it was a negative connotation, the phrase absentee ballot, because in theory you can vote by mail, or absentee if you will, permanently. Meaning, if you go off the rolls, we will send you a notice saying, hey, because right now you do it through 2 cycles. After you drop off the second cycle, we'll say, hey, dear voter, do you want to continue to vote by mail? You send it back to us, or you can call us, go to the website. You can get it through 2 more cycles. Yes, the signature is very, very important. When it comes back to us, the signature is paramount, quite honestly. And the problem we have is that we encourage it, but as we get older, our signature changes. And I don't know with this age group in this room, but I know Sarah Corley, when she turned 16, this is what's embarrassed me, your dad's the SOE. Her 16th birthday at 6 a.m., she woke up for school and I put a voter registration in her face and fill it out. And she signed it. And I'm like, no, I told you to sign it. They don't teach cursive. How many of you didn't have cursive when you went to school? Some? Okay. Well, they don't teach it much anymore after you all left because that's a problem. So there is, her signature is not really a signature. But yes, we look at that. If there's a variance, we get with the voter and say, hey, there's an issue. There had been a court case. The law had said prior, you can update your signature, and some counties wouldn't even notify the voter, which I think is derelict in my humble opinion. We reached out. One of my colleagues said, oh, it shows favoritism. You could say you're targeting too many R's, too many D's. And I said, not if you reach out to every voter, you're good. It had said to when you start canvassing your absentees, which is the start of opening them up and tabulating them. And there was a lawsuit, and the plaintiffs prevailed, so now you have until the day before to sign an affidavit to update your signature. But yeah, the signature is very, very important. That's a key point. I saw more hands up somewhere around here. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, the idea of being able to give people IDs for free is great, but that's not the only barrier. It's also transportation, getting off work to get there, having the knowledge that it exists. So it's I think yeah.
Great point. Now, just so you know, we have to, by law, send voters a sample ballot. You all should have gotten them in the past. And a few counties do 1 per household. I give 1 for each voter. It tells you on there all of your options. One thing we have to remember about with Florida, there are many states that don't even have early voting, let alone what Florida has with the flexibility of weekend hours, evening hours. There are many states that don't have no excuse vote by mail. Some states you have to do an affidavit saying I'm going to be out of town. So as far as accessibility, that's a concern, mind you. But there's still the neighborhood polling place, which most people can get to. But there's always that vote by mail is becoming more and more popular for that exact reason. And that's a great point. That goes back to the access. But it's there. It gets to them. And here's the thing. Some counties pay the postage to send it back. I don't. And I'll tell you why. I think it's preferential. Because if you drive to an early voting site, you don't call me up and I give you a gas stipend, if you will. Here's a couple of bucks for gas. But what we don't shout from the rooftops is every SOE in the state has a deal with the Postal Service. No ballot is ever sent back. Think about it. You forgot a stamp or insufficient postage, and it's 2 days before the election. Well, we're not going to send it back to the voter. That's stupid. So we take it and we pay the bill. $300, $500, $700 every election. But that's the best money ever spent to make sure that vote counts. But great point. I saw another hand. Yes?
I was on the same thing about accessibility,
Mm-hmm.
but I had a second question. It's gone.
I'll be talking about that. We'll come back to you.
So the next thing with voter registration, House Bill 1355 in 2011 by the Florida legislature, that was a tough year. So they reduced the number of days of early voting, but the real kicker was they made anyone who was doing voter registration, you're out there, you could be with a candidate, a party, or just on your own, hey, fill out this voter registration form. They made it to where you had to register with the state, list everyone who was doing voter registration, turn them in within so many, I think it was 48 hours, and there was teachers that will do voter registration drives in high school, which is wonderful. We want to promote civics. It's a little awkward when a teacher's threatened with a $1,000 fine because they didn't turn in the forms or they weren't registered. That was not very good. it's still in existence, but as of October 1st of last year, we finally pushed and got in online voter registration. So you can register online. There's another for convenience. If you're at the library or if you have access, of course, to a computer, not everyone does, and I get that. We have people just call us and say, listen, I need to get one. I'll mail an application and a stamp, an envelope back, and say it's all good. And we go above and beyond. Our job is to be the advocate, of course, for that purpose. But funny little sidebar to that, I had made it my mission to get online voter registration passed. I was the chairman of our legislative committee. It was surreal when we were being opposed by Florida Secretary of State. It was really surreal being in a committee meeting speaking in favor of OVR, how it helps. You can register 365 days a year. Our men and women in the military, overseas voters can register. It's cheaper, more accurate, and then the Secretary of State comes up and talks about the forces of evil or something. I was like, kind of strange. So we got it passed. The Secretary came and spoke at our conference, and me being me, went up there and kind of basically politely chastised him for his opinion. Went outside, there was a reporter there. This is a little sidebar when you're dealing with the media in the future. If you do, don't talk to them when you're not in the best of moods or a little bit angry or worked up. Bad idea. Adam Smith, Tampa Bay Times, said to me, Brian, how are you going to be certain that they're going to implement this? The law passed, but they have some latitude. Then I said, I've established an ad hoc committee of my peers that are experts. We're going to be on them. Yeah, you say that, but how do you, and he kept going on. Finally, I said, listen, we're going to ride them like Seabiscuit. As I said that, I'm like, you're not really going to use that quote. He goes, that's golden, man. So the next day in the paper, Corley says we're going to ride the Secretary like Seabiscuit. That was very, very, very uncomfortable. So the great thing with technology is there's things to be concerned about with technology as far as access with things like we talked about having a paper trail there voting. But there's ways around things. So right now, and we pressed the Division of Elections on this, I could be with the Florida Democratic Party, Florida Republican Party. I can come up to you, and I can have all the information filled out. You're not a registered voter. You click that. You click the button, and you're good to go. No third-party voter registration required because it's you hitting the button. That was a huge, huge thing. So the next thing, felon voting restoration. That's become a huge, huge thing. It had been, as you all probably know, Charlie Crist kind of came up with a kind of an if-then flow chart, automatic restoration. That was working great, and then when Governor Scott got elected, it kind of changed the dynamic. You basically have to wait a minimum of 5 years and then wait till the backlog's done and go up there and plead your case to all of them in about 25 seconds. And there's an amendment that's going to be on the ballot that's going to address that. How many of you support the felon voting restoration rate? Yeah, I'll raise my hand. I do. There have been studies that have shown for recidivism, it actually lessens that when you get people back doing their civic duty. I have a friend of mine, I won't say his name because it's being recorded. Childhood friend of mine did something really, really stupid, involved way too much alcohol, and ended up getting a felony over it. And he is now a professor at the University of Alabama, and yet still a convicted felon, can't vote. And so you can imagine him sitting on the sidelines during the Roy Moore campaign. That just drove him crazy. So early voting, we kind of talked about that. Again, let's not forget that Florida has a lot of states do with early voting. One of the things we did was, after 2012, we had lines. It was embarrassing. There was a lady in Miami-Dade still waiting to vote when President Obama gave his victory speech. How do you justify that? That's embarrassing. So I got called up in front of Senator Latvalle's committee, Ethics Elections, sworn in. Never been sworn in before. And we were all kind of grilled about practice and procedures. And the real issue we told them was, if at the time all of us wanted to put something on the ballot, we'd be limited to 75 words as far as maybe amending the Constitution. The legislature wasn't. In 2012, there were 11 amendments. Some of them were up to 600 words. So when you have Miami-Dade had like 6, 8, 9-page ballots. That's insane. 65,000 were dropped off the day before the election. There was just no way you could do that and not have those issues. So I went up there and said, listen, Florida is such a diverse state. If you think about it, look at what Miami-Dade, the needs of Miami-Dade are versus my own, Miami-Dade has 1.1 million voters. I just have a mere 345,000. But what Miami-Dade needs is not the same as what I need, and what I need is not the same as Calhoun County. So we said, give us that flexibility, and we got it. I will tell you, It came back to bite me in 2016. We have 8 days, 12 hours a day, even for a general, and it worked fine because the voting model had been vote by mail had been going like that. Early voting had somewhat tapered off. I was so confident early voting was going to continue to go like that. No one saw early voting going like that. So the first day we could have had it, somebody on Twitter said, "Hey, Corley, how come you don't have early voting day like Hillsborough County?" I wrote back, "I promise you on Saturday morning we'll have adequate resources and you'll be very pleased." Saturday morning came and this person took a picture of a rather long line and sent it to me and said, @Brian E. Corley, how's that working for you? And it was a great snap. I actually retweeted it because it was such a good snap. It was awkward though. So that's something that I had to personally own it as an SOE. So purging of voter rolls. Florida, back for the 2000 election, purged a whole bunch of felons. And I was talking to one of my staff who was there then, and she said it was the most horrible experience because there were people that list was rife with inaccuracies. And back then, let's not forget, there was no provisional ballots. You showed up in 2000, and there was some sort of clerical administrative error. Have a nice life, you're not voting. The great thing about the HAVA, as we know, no voters ever turned away. Never. I teach my poll workers, there's never a reason to turn someone away. When in doubt, give them a provisional ballot. What we saw during the presidential preference primary last year, we saw a whole bunch of people that strongly came out. Really wasn't Hillary so much. It was more for feeling the burn voters or for Trump. And basically, election day is a lot like a Corley family Christmas growing up. A lot of yelling. Voters just calling, "Yell at me." And what their issue was, "You won't let me vote for Bernie Sanders. I've been voting Democrat for 20 years." And as they're yelling at me and looking up, they've been a no-party affiliation. Which I would reply, what you meant to say, sir, ma'am, is in the general election ballot that we all get the same ballot, you've been voting for the Democratic candidates. You just outed how you voted, and that's fine. So that was certainly an issue. But then in 2012, the Scott administration attempted to do a voter purge based on finding that were non-U.S. citizens. They used what's called the SAFE database. You all know this, a federal database for benefits. So when they send us the stuff, I have to act on it legally. I'm the only one who can remove voters. I think I had 12 or 14 names on my list, mailed out the letters, and 3 people called the next day and said, "You're an idiot. I was born in Michigan. What are you doing?" The next day, "I was born in Arizona. What are you doing?" So that's when I said, "Stop, no more." And then a supervisor said, "We're not doing it because it was rife with inaccuracies again." So purging is an issue. We were talking about the Ohio case earlier. We talked about signature. Gerrymandering, of course, is an issue. And to find out what happened in Florida with the listening tour, all the maps were done behind the scenes, as you all know. That was a little bit awkward, you might imagine. Registration deadlines. In Florida, book closing kind of dates back to the term closing the books. 29 days before an election. How many of you say, "No, it should be same day registration"? One. Okay. Young lady, make your case. Why?
I think that it enables people who aren't necessarily aware of the system. Once they become aware of the system, they're still able to contribute to the election.
So you think election day just sneaks up on them?
Yes.
Jesus, I'm giving you a hard time. Anyone agree?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I knew you were going to hop in on that. Shocker. So there's been some talk about that. I have mixed feelings, I'll be honest with you. With the access to voter registration, it's wonderful how we've expanded, quite honestly. And Motor Voter was a wonderful concept, the National Voting Registration Act. The problem we have there is ironically enough, speaking of paper trail. So right now you can go online, it's all you doing it, right? You're checking off, you want to be a Democrat, you want to be a member of the Green Party. You fill out a voter registration form. I confess I love those because I have a scanned image. It's all right there. When you go, if some of you may think back, now it's at your tax collector. You go to the tax collector, you're the clerk behind the counter, it's all verbal. When they do the driver's license, they switch over to a separate program. They do the Motor Voter, and they say, are you registered to vote? And the problem we have with that statement is people think voting registration moves with them. We have a lot of transient voters who move from Pennsylvania, New York, Illinois. When you say you're registered to vote, we have people that will call us on election election day and say, well, I thought I was registered. I thought it just came with me. So we had them change to, are you registered to vote in Florida? But you're filling out on the computer like this, and basically they'll say, what party you want to be? And there's a listing over here. Oh, okay, I want to be a Republican. If you do a clerical error, it's human error, you check off no party affiliation, yeah, I get a receipt, but how many of you read all those receipts? Be honest. And you don't notice it, and then you are none too happy. That's the problem we have with the motor voter law as it exists. There's called the Delaware model, which I support, is where they have basically iPad kiosks set up in their tax version of the tax selector. Then you go over there, and then you get to select all the stuff. That way, it's on you, and your selections are there for accuracy. Disability voter access is definitely a huge issue. Voting information in public records. This is a tough one. I know you all have been probably following this one. It's not going to go anywhere anyway. I had Mark Caputo call and yell at me. Yeah. So right now, it's been reported and confirmed with intrusions, if you will, into state databases. You know, Illinois, as we know, and Arizona. Florida, there's nothing to go after because it's free. It's already there. For a mere $5, you too can have the entire statewide Florida voter file. And they changed it to $0? Okay, it's free. Great. If you Google your name, you will ultimately find yourself on a website called floridavoters.com, where all of your information's out there, your legal name, your address, if you gave an email or cell number. There's a gentleman who operates a site, he's not a gentleman, he's an idiot, out of New Hampshire, and sells advertising on that site. He's a few fries short of a Happy Meal. Voters are not very happy. They call and yell at me, and they think I'm personally responsible for it. And we've had people unregister, not hundreds of thousands. I think I've had 25 or 30 that physically, on the spot, said, I'm done unregistering. And that's kind of a sad commentary. But we have to balance with, again, going to balance with access to the information. And there was a bill pending to make it exempt, except for candidates, political parties, committees, etc. The problem is, I'm very sensitive to this. The media, academia, research just plays a vital role in what we do. And the California model I proposed, but no one wanted to listen to my idea. California has an exemption built in for that exact reason. That's reasonable. So that's certainly an issue. When it comes down to voter fraud, because that relates to confidence, which relates to access, if you will, it's really very, very sad that what we're up against as far as, you know, when you have a president just sort of just articulate in a tweet that there were 3 to 5 million legal votes without any real hardcore data. You know, I could tell you I'm from the planet Voltor. I prove it otherwise. How can you prove I'm not? You know. So when and I was telling this earlier. When I give speeches in my county, and you can tell a lot what's in the heart and mind of voters, constituents by how they ask questions. Someone will say, you know, let's talk about voter fraud. And they'll want to talk about non-U.S. citizens voting. Voter fraud is real. It does exist. It's just well, this is awkward. I had to turn it off. I'm sorry. At least my wife shut it off. Oh, no. I apologize. Oh, that's awkward. So, what was I saying? My AD's kicked in.
This is voter fraud and your...
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. So, voter fraud exists. It's not substantial. Come on. I don't know what I can do to turn this off.
Just take a picture.
Yeah. Hey, don't. Man, that's a great idea. One second.
You're welcome.
Seriously, I'm going to do that right now.
Tweet it.
Well, let me. Okay, thanks. Ready? I'm going to take a quick video. If y'all do me a quick favor, can you say Happy Valentine's Day, Mrs. Corley? Ready, go.
Happy Valentine's Day, Mrs. Corley.
Oh, you guys are the best. I love you, Beth. You just saved my hide. When a voter, when someone says, you know, what about these non-U.S. citizens voting? I can tell by their voice inflection and their eyes. I used to work at the sheriff's office, so detectives taught me some of these tricks. What they want to come out and say they don't have the guts is, we have Mexicans jumping over the Rio Grande going to the nearest polling place and voting, which is just not the case. Fraud does exist. You know what the real fraud is? It's people who are registered in multiple states and voting in multiple states. I don't have people tell me, yeah, I voted in New Jersey and Florida. Darn, I own property in both states, and I have a right to. I'm like, so if you own property in all 50 states, you can vote 50 times? Or they'll say, well, I only voted for president in Florida. You can check. No, I really can't. The whole secret ballot provision. So what we're advocating for is in the legislature, Florida joining what's known as ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. It's a kind of a nonprofit consortium made up of states. They worked with IBM. They developed secure, unlike what was sent to the Kobach Commission, if you will. It has algorithms to anonymize the data. It finds people who registered in multiple states. It finds voters who were deceased in other states. The problem is, if somebody dies in Michigan and Michigan doesn't tell Florida, how is Florida to know? ERIC finds those. If somebody moves down from Pennsylvania today and registered my office, which is likely that probably happened, if they don't tell Pennsylvania they moved, how does Pennsylvania know? Until they do the national change of address video list maintenance, which probably came up in the Ohio case. If when they come down here, on the form, it says previously registered. If they put their old address, Florida will notify Pennsylvania. All good. But if you don't tell Florida you're registered in Pennsylvania, you have dual registration. That in and of itself is pretty innocuous. That's not a big deal. It's when you're voting in two states, it becomes the issue. Yes, ma'am?
Can you repeat what Eric stands for?
ERIC. I'm sorry, I talk fast and mumble. I apologize. Electronic Registration Information Center.
It was originally developed by Pew.
Yes. Good. David Becker and Pew and all the good guys over there. House Bill 85, I believe, is what's working its way. And it's going to pass this time. And I think the governor's going to sign it. So we'll probably be on there January 1st. So that's very, very exciting. So those are the kind of the issues I talked about with, but again, go back to, yeah, we have our issues. You know, it was not long ago where we had some real issues. But where we are now, again, I stand by the premise, it has never been easier to register and to vote. We have hurdles that we need to overcome, and I recognize that with access to getting the polls, ID, etc. So that's my little dog and pony show. I'll turn over to Dr. Smith.
Great. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I would advise you to use Brian Corley's name, not mine, when you're reaching out to the SOEs. He was a former president of the Florida Association
SOEs?
of Supervisors of Elections, and is incredibly well regarded and knowledgeable, and is a nice entree if you're having any difficulty from the supervisor of your county or their staff. Do not use my name, because I'm a pariah, because I use public records and make lots of requests and am on folks, and I've tried to get better about not going to Mark Caputo at Politico, but talking to the supervisors when I find anomalies and whatnot. And I think we have better partnership, but it's not my nature to be conciliatory, it's more to be confrontational. Growing up in the Northeast, I guess. All right, I have for you an exercise in democratic participation, voting participation. Everyone stand up, if you would. So, literal exercise. Corley, stand up.
Yes, sir.
All right. Please sit down if you are not a U.S. citizen. Okay. Please sit down if you are not registered to vote. No, look at this. So impressive. Graham Center, it must be. Jesus. Look at this. This is, evidence right here. Kevin's doing great work. Please sit down if you're not registered to vote in Florida. No. Please sit down if you're not registered to vote in Alachua County. Oh. Okay. Please sit down if you are not registered where you currently live. Be truthful. Where did you? Thank you. Where did you register? What's the address when you registered? And where are you living now? I don't even care if you're down the hall in Hume Hall or wherever. All right. Please sit down if you pre-registered to vote when you were in high school or something like that.
Sit down if you do.
Sit down if you pre-registered. All right. All right. None of you pre-registered before you turned 18? All right. Please sit down if you have never voted before. All right. Okay. No shame in any of this. Please sit down if you usually vote an absentee ballot or a vote by mail. Okay. Please sit down if you registered to vote immediately prior to the last general election. I'm talking about sometime in August or September or up to October 6th. And then we had a little extension there because of a lawsuit. All right. All right, down there. Please sit down if you're between the ages of 18 and 29. Corley's still standing. You vote absentee? Did you sit down?
You say if you're not registered election,
If you're not, that's right. You don't count. You don't need.
I'm registered election. We have problems.
All right. Or Pasco. If you live in Pasco or Pasco. All right. Okay. You are all sitting down. I'm standing up. Guess who's voting? For sure. And guess whose vote is going to count? Look at me. I look different than some of you, and not only just because I'm twice your age. All of these factors, believe it or not, are going to influence whether or not you are going to turn out to vote and whether your vote is actually going to count. And some of it seems counterintuitive, right? What are some of the ones that seem counterintuitive? If you're pre-registered. Why do you think that if you're pre-registered, you're more likely to turn out to vote and your vote's going to count? Why might that be?
Because that shows that you're committed to actual being a civic participant.
Civically engaged as a youth. It's going to carry with you, okay? What else might think that it's the opposite of what I suggested? What other reasons? Civic engagement is good. Anything else? That's it? That's all you got going for you? What else?
You don't have to worry about registering by the deadline.
Don't have to worry about that deadline that I talked about, the 29 days that Mr. Corley talked about, right? That's good, because that's important, and the 29-day barrier does catch a lot of people. I mean, there are tens of thousands of people who will register after the deadline. Last year was October 9th, and we gave another week because of the hurricane in 2016. Still, there are tens of thousands of people who register thinking that they can vote, and they do turn out to vote, and they vote a provisional ballot because they haven't been registered. Right? Why might that not help you in terms of whether your vote's going to count?
You might not have known the party you wanted to be a part of.
Okay, so it goes back to here, right? On the primary, you might come out and you get frustrated because you registered as an MPA when you were 16 years old. You don't know yet. What else?
You don't remember that you
You don't remember you registered.
registered at all.
Yeah, that was just a civic activity. It was another thing to check off while you're busy doing your AP calculus, right? And so you don't remember, and so you don't remember where you were living. What else? Thank you. Yes, that's a good one. The other one is that you registered at a place where you no longer live, and you haven't asked for an absentee ballot, and you can't get back down to Palm Beach County or wherever, right? But that's the one that's really important. What did your signature look like when you were 16 and you pre-registered? Scribble, or generally it's, Brandy with a little eye and a heart over the eye, right? Brandy Smith. And, it's what Brian's daughter, my daughter's going to turn 16 in a couple weeks. Her signature is probably not what it's going to look like when she's a sophisticated University of Florida Gator and had to write her name on her Gator 1 ID for posterity. Well, in fact, posterity is that voter registration form that you signed when you were 16, and you have no idea what that signature looks like. Why does that matter in terms of whether your vote's going to count?
Because you have to have the same signature
When you do what? When you do what? Let's get to this point, all right? When you do what? When does that signature have to actually match? When you're voting absentee, right? So you don't have to have an ID to prove yourself of who you are. Even a Gator 1 now, you can work at the polls in person. You don't have to have an ID, but you have to do what? You have to somehow recollect how your signature looks like when you were 16 and pre-registered 4 years ago, maybe. And that is what has to be on the back of your absentee ballot if you're voting an absentee ballot. All right? And the fact of the matter, and I've got the data to show, you are much more likely, if you're voting an absentee ballot and you're between 18 and 29, to screw up. And there's no fault of you. We are moved into this. It's not only cursive. When I go to Publix, who cares what you're scribbling on there? That's my signature. Didn't reject my credit card. When I go wherever, Chipotle or whoever, whatever you're doing, going over to Pascal's and signing on some pad. Who knows what those signatures, they mean nothing. But your signature when you were 16 matters. And I think that's a huge irony, that here you are signing your ballot envelope in real time with your real signature, and somehow that could be rejected because of what you signed when you were 16 years old. And I've done some analysis too in terms of pre-registration. And indeed, those who pre-register are actually more likely to have an absentee ballot rejected than those who don't, in those same age cohorts even. So it's a positive good in terms of civic, but no one really thought about those implications with respect to this. I haven't published on it, but my colleague Mike McDonald did a study 10 years ago thinking about some aspect of this, but it's a fact, okay? What else did I talk about that seemed unfair for you all to be sitting down and me the only one getting past the ballot? What about, let's think about signatures for a second. I raised the irony that when I vote in person, I have to pull out an ID to identify myself as opposed to, and someone said, but you have to have your signature when you register. Well, I have to do a signature when I vote in person, right? How many of you have voted in person, either early or on election day? What did your signature look like? Anyway, someone who hasn't said anything. Genevieve. That's really fascinating. So you try to make it look like your driver's license that you had, but what about your ID on the books? That's the official ID at the Supervisor Elections Office. It doesn't matter. Isn't that interesting? That your signature actually has to match what you're bringing to the polls and not what's on the books. And yet, if you vote absentee, it doesn't matter what your signature is on your voter ID, because they don't look at that. It has to match up with what's on the book. That seems quite odd. But certainly, if you are aware of what your signature needs to look like when you're at election day, and usually the poll worker says you just need to sign, you have ID. You sign it to look what your ID, even though it might not match up with on the voter file. So we actually have to have two different signatures, many of us, to vote. One signature we use when we vote in person, one signature when we vote in absentee ballot. That seems insane, but that's the way it works. If you vote in absentee ballot, how many of you normally vote in absentee ballot? Because you're registered where you registered when you were 18 years old or 17 or 16, right? So you've kept your registration back in where you registered to vote. Seminole County, okay. Mike Corley thinks he has a better supervisor election staff than Brian Corley.
America's greatest election.
Yeah, America's greatest election, so, we can have them duke it out. He's former military, so. So you're not registered here. So you're going to vote in absentee ballot. We've already talked about some of the issues with respect to your signature, perhaps not matching what you did back then. The fact of the matter is that younger people are much less likely to have the correct signature. They're also much more likely not to have a signature at all. And this was a problem up until a couple years ago when the legislature actually said, we're going to have a cure for that, and if you don't have a signature on the back of your absentee ballot, you will have, how many days is it now? Up until election day, up until 5 p.m.
5 o'clock.
5 p.m. on Monday before election day, that you can actually go and cure your signature. Now, that raises questions of whether or not the supervisors are all proactive in terms of getting out there. Are they going to be using the phone number that might be on the voter file, or an email address? Or are they going to send out a postcard? Are they going to call you? It all varies, and there's no set standard on that across the counties, which is a real problem. I'm doing some work with Kendrick Meek Jr. on trying to figure some of these things out. Prior to the 2016 general election, I was the expert that was hired by the ACLU to challenge the fact that if you sign a signature that doesn't match, isn't that odd? That the person who doesn't sign has a chance to cure the ballot, but the person who signs because they screw up, because they didn't have the heart over the I on Brandy, doesn't have a chance to cure the ballot. And so the court agreed with our lawsuit, and so you actually have the same standard now. If you write a signature and it's caught as a non-match, you're supposed to send it out as a supervisor and let those people come in and cure by 5 p.m. on the Monday before election, right? But still, you have a higher likelihood of having your ballot rejected. I have some data here that, rather than doing a PowerPoint, I thought I would just print out, and I'll walk you through some of it. Pass those around. down the method of vote cast by one's race or ethnicity. Mr. Corley was talking about some attacks on public records, and yeah, I don't like my information out on the web, but the fact of the matter is, none of what I could have told you already could have been done without my access to public records. None of the identifying of potential fraud that I've done could have been found, or double registered voters could have been found without my access to public records. So the fact that you don't like Googling, and Google yourself some other time and see what's up there. And then compare that to the information that's in your public record, and then we'll have a conversation. Because you're probably going to be a little more embarrassed about that other information than what's on your voter file. All right? It's public record. Antonin Scalia, the great conservative justice, when asked before a Supreme Court case in 2010, Doe v. Reed, I happened to write an amicus brief in that case on whether or not the signature that you write on a ballot petition should be private, or whether or not it should be made public so that people could inspect it to see whether or not they thought there was fraud going on. Scalia, in the oral arguments, asked Jim Bopp, who was a University of Florida law grad and a very big defender of the First Amendment and the right to privacy, was asked by Scalia, "So, Mr. Bopp, does the Constitution protect your right to a private ballot?" And of course, Bopp had to say no, because there's nothing in the Constitution saying that your vote should even be protected. It's actually just convention that we've had, the secrecy of the ballot. You don't have a right to a secret signature on a petition. The court ruled 8-1 with Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg tag teaming Jim Bopp. It was a wonderful sight to see, especially since I was on the other side of that battle. All these data come from public records requests. And what's really fascinating is if you look at this, I've basically collapsed the voter file down to one's race or ethnicity. Your race and ethnicity is known on the voter file. You voluntarily put it in there, but most people do. The American Indian, Asian, other, or mixed is folks who don't put any information down on that category. There are 569,000 people in those categories who voted, right? That's how you should be reading this table. The total votes cast, about 6 million people voted. You can see the 1.2 million African Americans, or blacks as it's known, in the voter file. Hispanics, not Latinos, 1.4 million, 6.4 million whites voted. And then across each of those rows, I have down the actual raw number of the number of absentee ballots cast, the number of absentee ballots rejected by those racial or ethnic categories, the number of early in-person votes, the number of election day votes, and in between that, the rejected provisional. Unfortunately, the state legislature recently changed your reporting requirements of, was this a provisional ballot that was rejected from an election day vote, or a provisional ballot that was rejected from an early vote. And unfortunately, I can't disaggregate that because I would have to go to each county and do public records requests, and it's really not worth it. But if we look at this, let's take a look at going across the way. We can actually figure out what the percentage of rejected absentee ballots are. You would basically divide for the American Indian, Asian, other, and mixed, the 2,772 rejected absentee ballots into the 2,772 plus 147,223, all right? So it's 149,995. That comes up to 1.8%. 1.8% of absentee ballots cast by those racial ethnic categories were rejected. How many of you think that's a big number, 1.8%? That means your vote didn't count. It was rejected as, quote, illegal, I think is the technical term. Rejected as illegal. I love that stamp. Rejected as illegal. I mean, as illegal. All right, 1.8. That's a lot of votes. If you look over the whole, however, the 27,759 out of the 2.7 million, that's 1% of absentee ballots overall cast or rejected. What do you take away from that with respect to those two statistics?
It affects blacks and minorities.
Well, we haven't gotten to blacks and minorities. We're just talking about the racial, the American Indian, Asian things. You're almost twice as likely to have an absentee ballot rejected if you're of one of those racial and ethnic categories that I've lumped together in that first line than overall. Twice as likely is how I read that. It may have only been 2,700, but you are twice as likely to not have had your ballot counted. Let's look at blacks. For blacks, if you add those two together and divide by if you take the 4,692 and add it with the 241,013, you come up with 1.9% of all black absentee ballots cast in 2016 were rejected as illegal. Twice the overall rate. All right. In 2012, President Obama, knowing that there were going to be huge lines that Mr. Corley talked about, encouraged African Americans to go vote absentee. And if you look at the actual documents that they sent out in the mail, your vote's going to count. It's a paper ballot. Well, if you don't know what your signature looks like when you're registered in 1967, if you become infirm and your signature doesn't really match that, as opposed to what's on your driver's license or on your whatever card, your VA, your veterans card or your military card, you're going to have a higher likelihood of having your ballot rejected. And that's exactly what happened. It was almost 3 times as much in 2000. There was a hand up here.
I do have a quick question. In the case that your vote was rejected in terms of fraud, does the supervisor of election notify that person to let them know that their vote has been rejected, thus giving them the opportunity to go back and vote on the actual election?
Exactly. So it didn't exist in 2012. In 2013, I want to say the legislature cured that. Maybe it was 2015 that the legislature actually cured the missing signature on an absentee ballot. It wasn't until the litigation right before, in October of 2016, that the court ruled and the Secretary of State agreed that, and then the legislature codified that in the following year, that you have a chance that if the supervisor can reach out to you in time. But again, if that ballot is coming in on the Sunday or the Monday,
I think she's meeting after the fact, though.
or are you talking about fraud? Or are you talking about the absentee ballot?
After it wasn't counted, do we tell you your voter, your ballot was not calculated?
Yes.
Yes, we have to.
Yes, that is absolutely true. If your ballot doesn't count, you are informed, and that's been around for a while. So one would hope that if you get that, then you come in and you get it. Sometimes they will send out an affidavit, right, to update your signature.
We do.
Yeah.
And you know the irony is, we've done studies on this. We have repeat customers who got rejected. We sent them a letter, didn't count, update your signature, and then gets up to the next election, the same thing happened.
Right.
What are we doing?
So there are issues. There are issues in terms of the education of the voter and being able to do this and why some don't. Just going down that line, Hispanics 1.7%. If you look at the absentees rejected. Whites, if you do the math, anyone do the math while I was talking up here? No one did the math. No one was. You were listening intently. Sure you were. 0.7. So 0.7%. Take that 13. Now, again, I've been in litigation where the opposing expert says, well, 5 times as many whites had their absentee ballots rejected than Asian Americans, and it's like, are you serious? Who cares? I mean, I care that it's everyone's vote, right? But let's take a look at the proportion of these that are being rejected. So I think that's something to be concerned about, and it's something you might want to be thinking with respect to asking your supervisor, hey, can you tell me what the percentage of absentee ballots were rejected? You have the statewide stats here for 2016. I actually have all of them for your counties, but I'm not going to go through them right now. Yeah?
So just to clarify,
Yes.
you mean to say that is it a computer that looks at the signatures, or is it a person?
So this is a great question. It varies across the 67 counties. So Alachua County has a scan machine. I imagine Pasco does as well. The ballots come in their envelopes. They get scanned through. You don't do that? You're not big enough like Alachua?
Nope. Couldn't justify the cost. We're old school.
So Alachua, Tallahassee, and Leon County does it. I've seen that there.
Pitney Bowes machines.
Yeah, these Pitney Bowes machines, you got your stacks of the envelopes, they come in, and they've got an algorithm there that figures out how close does the signature that's on the digital file on the voter registration site match with the signature that's on the back.
So does that only look at the signature, or does it look at your entire ballot as a whole?
No, it doesn't open the ballot at that time. They do not. There's a very good protocol in terms of making sure that ballot is still, you're only signing the back of the envelope.
So how can you say that race is affecting this when it's not even looking at race if it hasn't opened the ballot card?
Isn't that amazing? Because I know every vote that has been cast and whether or not it's been rejected and by who it's cast by.
But how can you say it's been rejected by race if that is what you're
Because we know who the voter is. There's a barge code and they know it's coming in. How else do they know that you're not voting multiple times?
What I think my question was,
if they're comparing the signature and it rejects the signature based only because it's not similar enough to a prior signature,
Right.
but it's not looking at race, how can you justify that, oh, twice as many African Americans were rejected?
Those are the data. I'm not making the argument that supervisors are looking at the race of the individual and saying, we're going to reject this. I'm looking at what ballots were rejected and then matching it up to their race. Okay? Now, you ask a very interesting question, because in 2012, in the aftermath, I was very interested in that. Collier County. Anyone from Collier County? Where's Collier? Down in Southwest?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm not studying it. I'm from it.
You're from it, okay. It's down in Southwest Florida, right? Collier County, 6% of the Hispanics that cast an absentee ballot in 2012 had their absentee ballots rejected. The statewide average was about 1%. I'm looking at these numbers, I'm going, that's whack. What is going on? And Collier County was actually a Section 5 county, which was under the VRA. It was brought in 1975. VRA was passed in 1965. 75, there were amendments, and it was brought in along with Hillsborough, Henry, Hardy, and Monroe counties. And it was language, but it was also migrant workers going on in the sugar areas, sugarcane areas. I thought, wow, this would be an interesting natural experiment. What's the county due north of Collier County?
Lee.
You got it, Lee County. So you go from Fort Myers down to Naples, right? And there's is there a river running there? No, it's a parallel line. It's just a parallel line at that point. Lee County had less than 1% of Hispanic voters casting an absentee ballot that were rejected. I would subject to you that moving across a parallel line from one county to another, if you're Hispanic, is not going to make you less intelligent or less able to sign an absentee ballot with your name correctly. I would submit to you that it probably has to do with who is reading those absentee ballots. I can see an absentee ballot on that absentee ballot, and I'm not saying this happened. There may be other reasons, and there are actually other reasons. But if I'm reading the absentee ballots as they're coming in, as a temporary worker or as a staffer, I don't know whose ballot it is. All I have on there is the back of the envelope with the signature, and what else?
Their name?
No, your name's not on there. Your return address. How long have you been living in Gainesville?
2 years.
If I drew a line, say north-south on northeast 9th Street, and I gave you the name Jonathan Williams, and you lived east of there, and I gave you Jonathan Williams, and you lived in Hale, could you tell me with pretty good certainty whether or not I was white or black?
I could not.
All right, you haven't gotten out in Gainesville enough. All right, so I'm not saying that happened, but you give me an address, and I can tell you, because we have this thing called racial segregation in places like Alachua and everywhere, I can give you. Now, I'm not saying that happened. What I did, I said, and of course they said that wasn't happening, so I started looking at their absentee ballots, envelopes, and instructions, and they were quite different. And the standards were quite different of whether or not an affidavit had to be signed, as well as the back of the envelope signature, and dated on the back, as opposed to not. Or if you go up to Pinellas County, where they don't even have an affidavit. And there's just a big line saying sign here, and there's a sign on the back, making it very simple. You don't have to date it. If they're throwing out ballots because a voter, and again, there was no cure period at this time in 2012, because a voter didn't put in a date, or didn't sign the affidavit, and also sign the back of the envelope, they could throw it out and legally do so. But I would just say it's really difficult to come up with a good reason of why the same class of people, Hispanics, and I broke it down by age. I said, let's look at Hispanic who have voted in the last 3 elections, who are between the ages of 45 and 65. And those differences still existed. So again, is it intentional discrimination? Is it ballot design and the type of information that you have, whether it's in Spanish or not? Someone else has a question here. And then,
Yeah, when you're saying the differences in whether they had to be signed, dated, or the affidavit, is
Yep.
that by county or by within the county by voting district?
So it's supposed to be a county standard, but those county standards differ in terms of what's on the back of them. back of an absentee ballot envelope.
There's certain things that are required, but
Yep.
there's a little variation above and beyond.
There's some variation, and some supervisors say, well, what Pinellas County and Deborah Clark is doing is actually going around the law because there should be an affidavit there and there should be other information. She's made it very simple, and guess what? They have the highest percentage of voters who vote by mail, by far, and they have the lowest rejection rate of any medium or larger size county, by far, because they've made it dummy-proof. And she defends it. And you have others who say, we're not doing that, we're going to follow the law. And again, I don't know where to, I can't say where to stand on that, but there's a tremendous amount of variation. That's something you should be asking. Ask them to send you a PDF of their absentee ballot envelopes. And ask them to send you what their instruction is on how to cure an absentee ballot that didn't have a signature or had a mismatched signature. Ask them for the data. How many in 2016 general election were rejected? How many people cured their absentee ballots and sent back the affidavit with a signature or with a corrected signature? How many of those were actually validated then? Because my Brandy with the heart on the eye was then changed to Brandy Smith, looking very sophisticated, and then my ballot was accepted. That's all available for public information requests. I can't do it all across all 67 counties. I try to, but then they give me the finger, some of them. Not Brian. Brian's great. The staff is terrific. But others do, and you have the opportunity to do that. Okay? Alachua County in 2012 had one of the highest absentee ballot rejection rates in the state. And Pam Carpenter, the supervisor at the time, was defensive, embarrassed about it. But it was largely because we have a very high population of young people who are active and who don't update their signatures. Okay, yeah, there was a question too.
Is the algorithm that compares signatures, is that consistent across all?
No, I don't think there's even a standard. I've talked to Leon County. They have a slightly different thing in terms of how close is it. I actually had a team of students about 6 years ago go into Alachua County. I had to pay by the hour to have someone like TJ sit there and monitor us. But we actually took a random sample of absentee ballots that were verified, that were rejected, and that had no signature. Why did we take the no signature? We were just curious about them. But we were looking at the ones that were accepted and rejected. And of course, we're not looking at the actual ballots. We're looking here at the envelopes. So I'm sorry if I'm conflating that. We're looking at the back of the ballots. They're keeping them all for a certain amount of time. And I had my students actually with a tape measure, measuring the length of the signature to see whether or not shorter signatures had a greater likelihood of being rejected because of the algorithm or because of human sight, or longer, certainly having more variation that could be done. And the other thing that was really fascinating, and Brian, I don't know if you guys have looked into this, if you're working, and I don't know how this new system is, so I want to learn something here. If you registered at the DMV, how many of you registered at the DMV? All right. How many of you would say that your signature looks like the signature that was on the scratch pad when you signed it at the DMV? How many doesn't look like it? Right. Mine doesn't look anything like it. Because who cares? You try a couple times and you just say, forget it. Well, that's the signature that actually gets sent to Brian Corley's office. In the old system. I don't know about the online voter now, but that was the old way.
Same thing, that's where they pull.
Oh, it's the same thing. So it's, all right, and so it got worse than that, because what it did was it would take that and it would scan that and send it to Brian via email, secured email, and Brian would print it out, and they actually compressed the signature down to 300 DPI back in the day, and so the signature even looked bad worse. And so I actually had my students code whether or not the signature was a DPI, dot per inch signature, but you can tell from a digitized signature, or whether it was an actual signature. And guess what? We found a correlation between the length of signature, the shorter your signature, the less likely it was to be accepted, because there was more variation for either the computer or the human eye to look at, and those that were compressed from the DPI electronics were less likely to be there. Again, is this compressing, or is it the fact that I don't know what my signature looks like anymore because it's not what was on my driver's license and I'm signing it the way I want to. All right, these are all things that vary across every county in the same state, which, again, from a social science perspective, is wonderful because I've got lots of variation to study. And I've got a lot of different factors besides just the race and ethnicity of a voter. I can look at how they are embedded within their counties or precincts. Yeah.
Do you know where most of the SOEs get the algorithm from?
Most of them do not use automated, and I have to double check. Are you guys using the digitized signature? On the scan, because I think it was Leon that I remember watching it.
I'll have to check.
You have to check, yeah, because I can't. I remember watching it in person at Leon. I was going to all these different supervisors, and now I wanted to say that they had the Pinckney bows bringing in there to rip open the envelopes, but I'm not sure that they were scanning them. Whichever way it is, if you're scanning them, they still go to a human eye. They're putting a separate thing. All right, couple other things, and then I'll open it up to questions. And I know Brian has probably things that correct on my interpretation of all this. I also ran these numbers that I gave you here for age. Let me just give you an idea. You think why you sat down the last one was really unfair? You're 25 to, the 18 to 29-year-olds. All right. Let's look at whites. Again, this is information that is on your voter file. You put it down there. This should be the same number down here. So, of white voters who voted in the 2016 election, 721,646 were between the ages of 18 and 29. All right, that's out of the 6.4 million white voters. So you can do all that math. So it's not a huge chunk, and it's definitely a lower percentage than those who are in the 45 to 65 and the 65 plus ranges, right? If you voted an absentee ballot and you were between the ages of 18 and 29, you had a 2.8 and a white voter, 18 to 29. Your absentee ballot was going to be rejected 2.8%. 2.8% of all of those 721, it's not that many. It was 154,000 of you voted absentee out of the total vote. But of the 154,000, 2.8% were rejected as illegal of that 18 to 29. Did I say that okay that time? All right. Let's look overall. Overall, there were 1.97 million absentee ballots cast by white voters in the 2016 election. 0.7% were rejected. So you were 4 times more likely to have your absentee ballot rejected if you were a white voter, if you were between ages of 18 and 29, as opposed to overall. I could compare that to the 45 to 65 range, and I can tell you it's going to be even less than that 0.7, because that 2.8 among you guys is bringing that up. All right? That should be of some concern to you, because you're probably not dumb. You probably know how to sign your name, but there's something going on with respect to not being able to abide by the rules that are in place, and not knowing that it's not the signature that's on necessarily your driver's license. If you registered to vote in person with a canvasser, that's a different signature than what's on your driver's license, right? So that's something to think about. Just for fun, let's look at the different racial ethnic categories. So among Asian, other, Native American, and mixed, 4.1% absentee ballots rejected. For the 18 to 29 crowd, 1.8% for those overall. For black voters, 4.5% of the 18 to 29-year-old black absentee voters, 1.9% overall. For Hispanics, 3.9% rejected absentee, 1.8% overall. So the disparity is actually greater in terms of the number of times for white young voters, and that's who pre-registers more than anyone else, too. And so again, these are one of these unintended consequences of pre-registration. There are a lot of critics out there that say, we have people who are registering and we don't even know if they're going to be in the state anymore. That's not going to be the problem. The concern should be you have people pre-registering, doing their civic duty, and then having their absentee ballots rejected. because they don't remember what their signature was when they were 16 or 17 years old. All right, I'm going to get off my soapbox. There's a ton more I can talk about. Brian talked about a lot of really interesting topics. Language is something you should be all looking at. You want to find out if your county is offering not only ballots in multiple languages. I'm not only talking about Spanish. If you're coming in Broward County, you better make sure that there's Haitian Creole also being offered in some of those precincts, right? But we have growing populations. Russians in Miami. Anyone Russian descent? So that's something I think we really should be thinking about. Those other things I was talking about with respect to it's not only ballot access, it's being able to vote, register to vote, and having those registration forms in different languages. Having voter education with respect to making sure that students, younger voters, aren't having their ballots rejected because they don't know the rules of the game. I agree 100% with Brian. Florida has come a long, long way, more than I would say any other state, with respect to our changes since the 2012 meltdown fiasco. I gave you some articles. One of them is in Election Law Journal. What Brian said about the ballot length, that was the conventional wisdom. There are some nice little natural experiments you can use in terms of whether ballot length was leading to longer lines or not, right? So that piece, if you took a look at it, we looked at early voting sites. I can't remember. I have another paper on that. But maybe it was on election day precincts, early voting sites, and broken down by precincts. And we know when people voted because it's tracked. When you vote early, there's an early voting system, EVID system. And it electronically stamps when you came and cast a ballot. So I know what day and I know what time. And so I'm able to actually find out whether or not you voted actually on Sunday because you were in line since at least 7 p.m. on the final Saturday of early voting, and you cast your ballot at 2 in the morning in some Miami-Dade precincts in 2012 because the lines were so dang long. We were able to use that to figure out where were the long lines, and they all had the same length ballot in Miami-Dade, but you're able to see across precincts where those long lines were in early voting. African Americans waited in line in Miami-Dade much longer in early voting, where they were turning out to vote. Hispanics were much more likely to wait longer on election day when they turned out to vote, not only in Miami-Dade, but across the state. Purging. Let's hope that we don't have any more of these ridiculous things, and I commend Brian and the other supervisors when they were sent information from the Secretary of State's office in the summer of 2012, and were told you have to send, here's our list of people we suspect are not citizens, send them out with an affidavit, and they have 30 days to get it back to you, and if not, purge them from the rolls. I was part of that lawsuit that challenged it. It was the Arcia v. Detzner case. It went all the way up to the 11th Circuit. We won, and those voters were put back on the rolls. I have a paper that's coming out that actually looks at the Miami-Dade. There were 1,600 of the 625 voters who were on that final purge list. The 1,600 were from Miami-Dade. We matched those people up doing fancy algorithms with their doppelgangers. So you found a 29-year-old Hispanic woman who had been registered to vote for the past 7 years. We found her doppelganger who had also voted in those previous elections, who was also between 25 and 30 years old, living in the same precinct. And we looked to see whether or not they actually turned out to vote after they had the voting rights restored from the lawsuit. And we find that they had about 2 percentage point greater likelihood of turning out to vote. And so we argue that it's this reactance theory. And I'm sure you're dealing with that with your daughter. Maybe she's much better. She's going in the military. Mine's not. About, oh, you can't have the car. You can't have the keys. You get that. Well, I'll show you. I'm going to go out and do it. So that's this reactance theory. You're going to take away my voting rights. I'm going to be darn sure that I'm going to turn out and vote because you're insulting me. And Miami-Dade had 500 people who provided affidavits and documentary proof of their citizenship before finally the supervisor said, this is ridiculous. We're elected officials, and we're telling 92-year-old veterans who have fought in World War II that you're not a citizen and you've been voting since 1960 in Florida? Forget it. And so the Secretary of State finally backed off. The governor finally backed off because the Secretary of State reports to one person, the governor. He has a constituency of one. You've got several. So there's a lot to be asking, and I really encourage you to talk to one another. You're putting together a final report, or someone's going to put together a final report. Talk to one another. Crowdsource some of the questions. You want to be asking the same questions as your classmates here. And figure out what, you can't ask all the questions, Brian has other things to be doing, but figure out those important questions from what we've been giving you so that you can actually have some consistency across these reports, because this could be a really great report. Yeah?
So, in regards to clergy, isn't it still law that you can purge people if they haven't voted the last 2 elections and they don't respond?
No, not quite. Okay, so, all right, so, no. If your supervisor told you that,
You didn't hear that from me there, Pasco.
no. Okay, so January 7th, the Supreme Court heard a case out of Ohio. It was brought by the A. Philip Randolph Institute, and it was argued by the ACLU, DEMOS, and the National Voting Rights Center. I happen to be the expert for that case. And the case was challenging Ohio's law, which Ohio was interpreting the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, of saying, okay, we can use the voter registration information that we're getting when voters move, with the National Change of Address, when we match it with databases about death index, the Social Security death index, when we get information coming from the felon lists, we can take them off. But we know there are other people who don't exist. And so we're going to infer that by whether or not they've cast a ballot in the last 2 elections after getting a notice after not voting in another election. So it's actually, in Ohio, it was don't vote in an election, get sent a card, don't vote in 2 more federal elections, general elections, and then we can purge you, just because we don't think you exist. The plaintiff in that case, you have to have a plaintiff to challenge the law, was a former military guy, a white guy, probably a Republican, they don't have voter registration by party in Ohio, who didn't vote in 2010, didn't like any of the candidates, didn't vote in 2012, didn't like any of the candidates, didn't vote in 2014, and then came out actually in 2015 in a statewide election where they have referendums on the ballot to oppose a medical marijuana measure that he didn't like. And he went to the polls and he was told, sir, you're not on the vote. What do you mean I'm not on the vote? I've been registered, I've been paying taxes. It's the same county that's administering my elections that I'm paying my taxes to. I've lived in the same house. What do you mean you're not registered, you can't vote? He was the lead plaintiff, and the ACLU is really good at finding plaintiffs that are not the destitute, homeless, where, oh my goodness, you don't have, all those prejudices against those people. They find people who look just like the judges who are going to be ruling on these cases. And, they're not dumb about that. And the court actually ruled in favor of Ohio, saying, well, you were sent a notice, you threw it out, you should have sent it back. The appellate court at the 6th level said, no. Ohio, you can't go purging people just a use it or lose it deal. That's what has been argued, and it's been argued before the Supreme Court. I think they're going to probably lose. The court is very conservative, and you don't have an Antonin Scalia on there who's a conservative but also says, screw it, why should I have to vote just to keep my registration, paying taxes and everything else? So that's not the law. How do you interpret Florida's law? Because I've actually heard different things as well in terms of...
Well, we do by statute, Chapter 98 says we have to do a biannual list maintenance. We basically, those who didn't do anything, reach out saying, hey, dear voter, what's the dealio? And if you don't get back to us, if you do get back to us, all's good. If you don't, you're moved to inactive. If you're inactive, no big deal. You show up to vote, you become active. You call us, order a vote by mail ballot, do change anything, move to active.
Right.
But
you're not purged off it. You have to die, commit a felony, and have that come from the state.
Yeah.
Move, and there is a problem. I'm a supporter of the ERIC system because that's one area where I was still getting request an absentee ballot from Colorado when I moved to Florida 2 years later because they hadn't yet done it, and I didn't tell them. I'm not going to vote there. I could care less, but I'm still getting sent messages, and more problematic, I was getting sent all the junk mail from the candidates. But it is an issue. But there are about 7 states that do what Ohio does. That if you don't use it, you're going to lose it.
But after they're inactive, you can take them off if they don't respond to your mail.
Well, not necessarily. What happens happens is, if they don't respond to your mail, then yes, you can under Florida law. If they don't respond,
But it has to be a certified, you have to send
Yes.
certified.
That's
The
the
difference
key.
is, they have to send a certified mail, return to sender.
Yep.
Ohio doesn't do that. Ohio just sent a postcard out saying,
Yep, that's
send
the
this
key
back
difference.
if you want to stay registered.
So what's the difference between certified and just a postcard?
Well, certified, you got to sign for it.
Yep.
And if you don't sign for it, then it gets sent back. And then you can be taken off. But you have to do it systematically. You have to do it for
And
all of them.
yes, we'll get back the little yellow label
Right.
on, potentially thousands. They moved out of state. Well, that makes it real easy then.
Right.
It proves they moved.
Ohio wasn't doing that. Ohio was just sending out a little postcard saying, send this back if you want to stay. If you didn't vote, we noticed you didn't vote, send it back. And he said he never got the mail. It was probably a piece of junk mail or whatnot. And then they said, well, that's cause. And so the whole law, I was in the oral arguments in the Supreme Court, the whole case hinged on whether or not what triggered Ohio to purge someone. Was it triggered by non-voting? That's what my side was saying, the ACLU. They were saying, you are purging people for not voting. What Ohio was saying is, no, we didn't purge people for not voting. We purged them because they didn't respond to our postcard. And of course, it's circular because you didn't respond to the postcard because you only sent it out to the people who didn't vote. Had they sent that postcard out, return to sender, to everyone registered, then it would be compliant to the NVRA, I think. But again, I'm kind of dubious that our side's going to win, and that Ohio might win.
So the only difference is certified mail in this case.
Yeah, but it's a big difference. It's a big difference. And about 7 states are doing that. Again, that's one of the areas where Florida is better. Florida is better on early voting by miles than most states. Most counties now are doing it for a full 2 weeks. They're doing it both Saturdays and Sundays. We have up to 156 hours or something like that of early voting. 2012, Governor Scott pushed the legislature to change down House Bill 1355 down to these 8 days at 8 hours, and it was 8 days for 12 hours, and it was horrible. It created those huge long lines. We have that no excuse absentee ballot. You can be permanent absentee, where you just have to do it once. You check that box off, but every county does it a little differently. Not every county is proactive in terms of wanting to have the absentee ballots. We have really lax, I think it's 11 different voter IDs now that you can use at the polls.
12 now. 12.
Is it 12? All right, 12 IDs. You can now use your Gator 1. You can use your student. You can use your gun license. That was the trade-off. But many other states, you have to use your driver's license or your state-issued ID.
What's the benefit of purging inactive voters from the voter rolls?
Well, you want to have the integrity of your voter rolls. It's a balance, I think, is that, if you register to vote in Alachua County, do you just leave it alone and someone's registered for the next 200 years versus, hey, you haven't voted, we're just sending a little postcard, you're out of there, you show up to vote. There has to be a balance between making sure if you don't vote, you're aware of the consequences, as Dr. Smith alluded to, versus just don't do anything, keep them on there forever. So that there has to be some kind of common sense applied.
So a little fun fact. The county that tends to have the highest turnout is which county? Of registered voters.
In the state?
In the state. Almost always.
Collier.
Yeah. All right. So do you think partly it has demographics, right? You've got a lot of old folks, a lot of white folks who turn out to vote. And they're coming from Wisconsin and Illinois and Iowa. They're coming down and they're going to vote. It's also because they have one of the most active list maintenance programs in the state. And they make no bones about that. One of the things that Collier County does more than any other county, maybe others are catching up, not for good necessarily, I'm curious of what Brian does, is that Collier County regularly goes out to this county clerk of courts and asks for all the people who checked off the box saying that they were not a citizen when they were trying to get out of jury duty. Now, the interesting fact is you don't get called for jury duty unless you're on the voter rolls. And if you're on, it is true.
No, it used to be that way. No longer.
Oh, it's not like it.
Well, no, you
It's
just
your driver's
gave me
license.
chest pains. That's an urban legend. It wasn't that way, but now it's by having a driver's license.
Do you have to have the star in terms of your citizenship?
I don't believe so.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't believe it. But it was about 12 years ago, I think it changed from.
So it's not the driver, they're not using the citizenship checkoff from the real ID. They should.
They should, but I don't believe, I have to check with DHS on that.
But it's interesting. So if you want to get out of jury duty, do not check that you're not a citizen. You all are because you all said you were. Do not check that because they're going to send it to the supervisor and then you're caught in a bind. You either lied on your voter registration form or you lied on the affidavit to get out of jury duty. But Collier does that, and they were finding all these non-citizens. Well, it turned out maybe some of them were, but there were also people who were doing it because they wanted to get out of jury duty. But they're very active in terms of sending out notifications. But it should be the real ID.
I'll check.
I mean, do you guys do that?
Yeah, we do.
You do.
In fact, there's a bill that would require us to do it, but most counties actually do it already.
Some do it a little more aggressively than others.
Yeah, we don't get that many, but as a matter of routine, we get it, and invariably, it's I didn't want to go to jury duty.
And
they're not really non-U.S. citizens. They just who wants to get called for jury duty? No, honestly.
So you've committed perjury one way or the other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's not good. We got a couple more questions, Kevin?
Yeah, we have time for other questions.
Go ahead.
After what happened in Broward County in 2016 with the canvassing board, have y'all changed the way that y'all handle your file ballots or anything like that?
Well, you mean the allegations of the fraud in the office?
Locking themselves in the room and...
Yeah. So everything there was a little bit of a misinformation about that. The person that worked there, what they did, they claimed that they saw voter fraud happening, that they were filling out ballots like to commit voter fraud. So what happens is, for example, vote by mail. This is a real big issue. Voters will do all kinds of weird stuff to ballots. They'll tear them in half. We tell ourselves they spill coffee. That's what we tell ourselves. But by law, we have to duplicate that ballot. So we go through the tabulator. So we do exactly what Broward does. All counties do.
The canvassing board is supposed to be present when they're making the ballot, correct?
Well, the canvassing board is supposed to be present pretty much during the whole thing, to be honest with you. But are you referring to the canvassing board being present, or the allegations of they were
the ballot, and then y'all have to check the ballot to make sure.
Right. They're supposed to be there. Yes. That was a big no-no.
But have y'all changed the way with public perception? How, like when it comes to allowing people in or stuff like that?
Some counties, I'll be honest with you, this goes back to uniformity. To me, it's all about public perception is what is, transparency is the cornerstone of what we do. We have a mini check and balance known as the canvassing board, which is a county judge, county commissioner, myself. I can only speak for Pasco. Once we go, we're all there. Nobody leaves. Some counties will meet and they basically empower the supervisor to oversee all of the canvassing, the absentees. That's, I'm not speaking of ill of my colleagues, I would never do that for that exact reason. So I would think after 16, I would sure Broward probably wouldn't do that again because of the perception issue, but I can't speak for Dr. Snipes now.
And one more quick question.
Sure.
I was just going to follow up on that. I mean, if you go and watch canvassing board, you're welcome to go in there.
Please do.
And they basically are taking those ballots that have been spoiled because of the water or a tear, and they're not being read through. And the absentee ballots, at least in Alachua County, are the exact same as the election day ballots in terms of their format. Mm-hmm. They get spit out, they're put in a stack, and with their envelopes, and they have two different people that are separated by a little barrier. And one pulls it out and hands the ballot over here, and the other person is filling out, and then they verify to make sure that those were, but you don't know who then voted it, because the ballot envelope with the signature and the address is not the same as the person who's actually verifying, filling it out. But they have to be filled out so they can run them through. Broward County has other, issues. Who's doing Broward? Are you from Broward?
No, Mike.
Okay. Anyone else doing Broward? You're from Broward? All right. So I'm involved in the litigation defending Broward County that you've been reading about in terms of Dr. Smikes.
Oh, you're defending her that way. Wow, geez, you think you know somebody.
Yeah. No, I'm on the defendant interveners. So this lawsuit, real quick, this is a really interesting lawsuit, right? So this is the flip side of what's going on in Ohio. This is former Bush Department of Justice conservatives claiming that there are some counties that have way too many registered voters for their population, of voting age population.
Oh, I thought you meant the burning of ballots.
No, this is different. I'm not doing that one. No, I'm not doing that one. That's absurd. I believe in public records. So I'm happy to work on the other side on that one. And so they've come in, they've identified counties. They happen to be all African American predominant counties, mostly very small and all across the South. And because there's not protections anymore because of the Shelby decision with eviscerating the protections under the Voting Rights Act, many of those little counties have settled with these organizations, with 3 different conservative organizations. There's a great Harper's piece and some others you can just Google on them. And they do so because they don't have the resources to fight those lawsuits. So they settle and they say, okay, we'll do a better job of making our list more up to date. Broward County, because they have the resources, because Dr. Brenda Snipes is a force of nature, has to fight this suit. And so I was brought in as a defendant intervener expert for the ACLU and DEMOS and the same old groups that are defending voting rights because they want to make sure that that case it's going to set precedents, has experts and lawyers beyond what Broward brings. That's what a defendant intervener does. They bring in that power of these high-powered lawyers and some decent experts to defend it. So that's that lawsuit that has to do whether or not they were keeping their lists up to date, whether they had all these voters over the age of 100. How is this possible? Well, there are a lot of freaking old people in Broward County, if you've ever been there. It's not unusual. So, are there questions of whether or not they are double registered in another state? Well, these are issues. It's another question of whether they're voting because they haven't updated it. And so, again, that's where I have no problem with Eric in terms of things. You had another question, sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to get both of y'all's opinions on this. First, Corley, do you use AutoMark or Express Vote for your education plan?
We use Express Vote. Those who know, Express Vote is for voters with disabilities.
And I know at the last conference y'all had a big thing about this, but they had the bill in the House, I think it's the House, saying that to use Express Vote and stuff like that for actual, for everybody.
Universities, yes,
Which
sir.
would mean that anybody could use the Express Vote and have the thermal paper as your ballot. Does that bring up any ethical concerns or anything like you for having the ballot and now you're going to a piece of thermal paper which doesn't play all the choices?
Actually, the paper's not thermal. At least the ones we use for voters with disabilities in Pasco, maybe some use thermal that has that capability, of course. It's funny, by the way, House Bill 709 is being heard in Public Integrity Committee on the 22nd at 9 a.m. if you want to follow that bill for just that. Personally, I like uniformity. I like all my ballots look the same. Election day, voted by mail, and early voting. Where the voter did this versus the printout. So even if they do pass that, I'll still be status quo.
And do y'all allow overvotes? Or do you reject those? Because I know there's some counties that reject overvotes and only allow undervotes.
Well, by reject, I mean,
Like if you went to the polling place and then had overvotes and then you put it into the DS300, would it kick it back out?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay. And
Everyone should be programmed to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And only the voter touches it. What happens is people make mistakes. So if you overvote, sometimes people will say, exactly. Now it tells you which particular race it is. It used to be just the overvote. You have to try to find it. But sometimes voters will say, I'm late for school or the dentist. They'll just hit accept. It goes in. And so it has consequences. I mentioned earlier in 2000.
The other races and ballot questions will count, but that one won't if it's
Yeah, but I know there's some counties that will kick the ballot out and won't accept it. Like,
It's supposed to 3 times. You get 2 strikes, and the third one, it's it. But you have 2 chances to go and get a new clean ballot. But again, it's time and lines and other things that do that.
Let me, if I forget, so I have good news for y'all. When you sign, like at Publix, think of Election Day. I do it myself. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's no comparison. It's not uncommon for me to sign 300 things a day, and by the end of it, it's indecipherable. My chicken scratch. But the good news is, under Florida law, that's why I teach my poll workers, when it talks about in 101.043 ID at the polls, the very last sentence of the ID provision, you can have a photo ID, and then the signature can be anything. The signature doesn't have to
match that ID. That's right.
It can be a cocktail napkin, to be honest with you. But the last sentence says, if the clerk or inspector is satisfied as the identity of the elector.
Yep.
That's the kind of the safety valve, if you will. Now, the machines that some counties use, they borrowed the technology from banks. We're going there, but the problem is the algorithm sometimes can be too tight, where it just kicks everything out and you're back where you started, or too loose where everything goes through. What we do is we have we're blessed to have the same staff, temps come back year after year, and our full-time staff. They look at on the screen, compare the signature. If they make the adjudication that it matches, and I'll be honest with you, I've had my staff trained by an FBI forensic signature expert, and it comes down to it's either there or it isn't, most likely. If we see John Smith or Susan Jones, oftentimes if they're older, if you can make out the J or the S, there's the Boardman versus Streetup basically said the tie goes to the voter. In the absence of fraud, you give it to the voter. So if we find one that's questionable, it goes in the questionable pile. When I first got there, I looked at those and I thought, wait a minute, I'm one of 3 on the canvassing board. If there's a lawsuit, I want to be able to say I looked at it with the judge and the commissioner. We look at those, and it's three votes, if you will. And honestly, even if you have a stroke, this is what I tell people: if you have a stroke and the best you can do is an X, and that's what we have on file, we will count that. We need to do a better job in our community of election administrators of truly letting people know the significance. We're in between elections. You all don't think about the Alachua County SOE, except maybe TJ now. But we're out of sight, out of mind, and we get that. The problem is you show up on election day, you haven't updated your address, you have to update your signature. It causes issues. So what we're trying to do is be creative. Like, for example, in my county, I go every week to the jury pool, and I speak to them, and we have staff that brings it even. We have folks that come over, because there's a lull, before they're ready, they'll go over and check their address to make sure it's up to date. They will go ahead and update their signature if they haven't done so in so many times. And so that's an important consideration. We do best practices. While we could use uniformity, if you haven't looked at our David Stafford of Escambia County, had a group come, was the Center for Civic Design, looked at his vote by mail design, all his materials, tweaked it, and the number of rejections went way down. So we basically just going to borrow and steal that. Now, I will tell you this.
They borrowed and stole it from me.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay, well, thank you then. The only thing is with provisional, absentees are a concern. Now, I confess in my county, I'm asked by the media once in a while when it comes down to rejection rates with certain minority groups. I don't look at that. And honestly, and I do it deliberately. I look at the aggregate, because to me, I don't care if you're Native American or you're African American or you're Hispanic or white. To me, why didn't it count? That's just my personal view of how I look at it. But it is a concern, seriously, if there's an issue. But with provisional ballots, I've had 100% of provisionals count. The lowest I think I've ever had was 83%.
Yeah.
But you got to look at why they don't count. If someone shows up screaming, I don't care what your stupid machine says, I'm registered to vote, and you look at it, and they were removed in 1978, it's not going to count. Whether regardless of one's view, if someone's a convicted felon, they want to vote, it's not going to count. Those sort of things, if you will. Someone shows up at this is a good discussion for another day. You show up at your old precinct. You move and you go to precinct day where you used to live, and I've had this happen. 650. You're not going to get to your new precinct if you vote the precinct day. You're committing a third-degree felony. Your options are slim. If you really want provisional, we'll give it to you. It's not going to count. It's the ones that don't count that should count are the real concern. That's what you really have to look at.
That's tough. And as a poll worker, do you turn a blind eye when they tell you where because you're not asked where you live when you vote in person. They ask you your name, and then you verify what's on the poll books. And so if they say, you live at 1614 Northwest 14th Avenue, and you actually moved down the block or across the way, you are committing,
Third-degree felony.
Third-degree felony. But you do have a right to vote, so it's an interesting one. And I don't know if anyone's been challenged on that.
There's been some discussion about letting them vote the ballot and then only tabulating the commonality of races.
Right, exactly, and that makes a lot of sense.
I have no issue with that.
Right, the statewide ones.
Yeah, I'm all right with that.
One of the things to think about, last little bit. So many counties are moving from early voting, where they have every county now has the even machines for early voting, the electronic machines. The electronic machines are great for voters who come with a valid, up-to-date state ID, driver's license. And the poll workers love it because they just swipe it underneath, swipe it through. And it pulls up your information. They say, Dan Smith, yes. Is that your address? Yes. Here's your ballot. And they print it out electronically, and because it's early voting, it's from everyone in the county, they make sure that you have the right precinct. It's terrific. I'm, again, a pain in the neck, and I always vote with my bank card.
Yeah.
Because that's one of the things that's allowed. And I do it just to see whether or not the poll workers are following the law. And so I'll walk in on early voting and say, yeah, I'd like to vote. Do I see your ID? Yes, here's my ID. My bank card has my little picture on it, and it has my signature. I could actually have another piece of ID that has my signature. That's one of them. Some of them will try to swipe it. It doesn't work. Do you have a driver's license? I'm asked. Yeah, it's right here. Could I have it? Nope. I'd like you to use this. And of course, the people behind me are getting pissed off. But they don't like having to use this or your student ID or anything else because they can't scan it. And so they have to sit there and punch in my name, and there are 4 Daniel Smiths in my precinct alone, much less in Alachua County. And so then they have to search through to find my address. And I say, yes, that's me, and then they print out my ballot. I validated myself, but I'm slowing down the system. And I'm not doing it intentionally to slow down the system. I'm doing it to make sure that they're aware that other people may not actually have a driver's license and should be able to be processed, but might not know it. Because I have seen and witnessed this when people are asked that question, do you have a driver's license? And they say no, they leave the polls. Maybe they go back, or maybe again. And that is against the law. And it shouldn't happen, but it happens because the poll workers are human. They want to move. The people behind you are pushing you to hurry up when they're waiting out the door. And so I know that I have privilege to do that because of my education, because of my race, because of my age, whatever, and because I know the supervisors. And I basically call and say, hey, you've got some issues over here. But that's something that you really can't get at. If you ask Brian Corley, he's going to say, no, you can use any ID. But as we move more to the electronic voting, not only in early voting, but on election day, that's going to be, again, one of these unforeseen consequences when people come in and don't have the type of ID that the scan can run through to pull up your ballot, and it takes people off the line to type in that stuff. And my concern is always with the voter, potential voter, of maybe leaving and reneging because the poll worker is kind of going through the motions, and it takes time.
It's a concern, definitely.
It's a
Let
concern.
me just say this, if I may,
Yeah.
a parting thought, because you've had to listen to Dr. Smith and I ramble on for 2 hours. It's been fun, though. So I was asked about the future of voting in my county. It's about 200 people, and it was at like a chamber banquet. And I said, as I mentioned, I believe to you, I talk fast and mumble. Here's what not to do when you're speaking to a group of 200 people. When you're asked about the future, I said, there's talk about moving towards biometrics, using your fingerprint, for example. And I was thinking in my mind, the eye scan, retinal, but I talked fast, and what came out was rectal scan. Somebody goes, well, that's way too invasive. I'm not voting on that. I will say this, though, and I mean this because you guys are absolutely awesome, and I've been where you are. If you want to write down my email address, it's very simple. Corley, BCORLEY @PascoVotes, PASCOVOTES.com. I can write on the board if you'd like. Honestly, seriously, shoot me off an email. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to help out from a practitioner's perspective. If you want an introduction, if you tell me, hey, I'm working with so-and-so county, I can go ahead and reply to you and CC the supervisor and say, hey, I personally know them. He's like, I know you all now. Help them out. Most of my colleagues and I have a soft spot for being a student myself, research. We get a lot of public records requests. I go out of my way when I get stuff for like Dr. Smith and others, but students, I'm like, remember that. I've been there, done that. So I don't mind even creating stuff that's not public record in the interest of helping advance the science. So please feel free to email me if you guys have any questions.
I just tweeted you out at Vote Pasco.
At Vote Pasco, yes.
I put in the @Graham Center, so you can find that on Twitter. And so
further proof from Mrs. Corley. I sent her the video about that.
Exactly. Do not use my name. Use Corley's name for your introductions. Please remember that.
Please help me thank both of these gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. I have the sign-in sheet up front. Please make sure you hit that before you leave. Thank you all. Well, fortunately
that what you were just talking about? All I heard was Dream Defender, so I was like, okay, well, yeah.
Well, then I should stop this.